We're absolutely delighted this afternoon to have our guest speaker, Dr. Daniel Kilvington. And Daniel is a reader, a course director in media and cultural studies at Leeds Beckett University. And Daniel's going to talk to us today about a very topical subject, I think, which is investigating online harms, sport and gambling. Thanks very much, Daniel, and over to you.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for the invite, and it's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. So yeah, I'm going to get cracking and run through the research that myself and the research team that I'm working with have been doing over the last few years, really. So the title of this presentation is Investigating Online Harms, Sport and Gambling. Okay, so to give a quick outline in terms of what we're going to be discussing, I'm going to explain what TOHIF is. Now on the side of the screen, you see Tackling Online Hate in Football. That is the name of the AHRC and Irish Council funded project that we started a couple of years ago, and we're now into our final year. So I'm going to explain what we've been doing on the project, what our findings are, and again, how that relates specifically to gambling harms. And that's certainly one of the themes that's come out of the research. I'm also going to discuss a word on terminology as well, and specifically the difference between online abuse, online hate, and online harms. So as you see, the project is called Tackling Online Hate in Football. When we started, it's certainly now much broader, and some of the harmful activities that we've seen, which we possibly didn't expect when we started, we're now starting to use the term harms or abuse, possibly a little bit more than specifically hate. Then I'm going to look through the context of this, so look at what the problems are around kind of sport and online harms, and again how that relates to gambling. Then I'll run through a methodology, which is how we've captured the big data, how we've done the qualitative data as well. Overarching themes. Then we'll look into the types of harms and abuse that exist, and again in relation to gambling, player experiences and impact, and then we're going to look at basically football's response or stakeholders' response, and consider what action needs to happen going forward. So we'll end with that and possibly have a chat around ways to kind of move forward in this space. Okay, so that is our research group, smiling faces on the side of the screen. We've also got a link to the website there, which is just tohif.com. And I'm a co-investigator on that project. As I said, we started, I think it was 2021 or 2022. We're a couple of years in, and we're now into our final year. We've got a lot of data, and we're building an international network, really, to kind of produce further outputs as well. Okay, so as I said, we're going to look through online abuse, online hate, and online harms just to see the difference in what we mean by those terms. Sometimes they're used quite interchangeably, but I think we need to be clear on how we're using those terms as well. So online abuse, as in a forthcoming publication, it's defined as one-off or prolonged offensive or hurtful remarks, behaviours or actions which do not necessarily link to someone's protected characteristics, and thus it may not constitute a criminal act. And that's the difference there between hate, so hate speech, attacking someone's protected characteristics, can lead to legal action taken. If it's abuse, saying to a footballer, you're rubbish, you shouldn't be on the pitch, that's more abusive rather than hate speech. So there's a difference there, but of course, sometimes abuse can result in legal action as well, of course. So that's the first one. The second one, as I've said, and I've already outlined the difference there, which is online hate. So that's spreading, inciting, or promoting hatred, violence, or discrimination against an individual or group based on their protected characteristics. And those characteristics include things like race and ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, disability, among other social demarcations. So when we started the TOHIF project, we were very much looking at online hate speech. So that was, again, racism, homophobia, misogyny, those types of things. But as we've gone through the research process, and as I've said, now we're in our final year where we've got a lot of our data and analysed a lot of our data, we've found that there are other themes and aspects that are wider than just specific hate and wider than abuse. And that leads to the third point here as well. So the third one is a term that Bristol Gambling Harms use, so are aware of, and it's beyond hate and abuse. So it relates to and it can encompass abuse and hate, of course, but it's certainly a broader term. And there are certain harmful things that exist within sport and players playing sport. So we've got doxing, we've got sextortion, we've had bribery, we've had catfishing, we've had swarming, we've had examples of misinformation and disinformation. And this is more of a holistic term. So it's beyond just hate and abuse, and it encompasses all of those broader things as well, which are harmful activities that that certain people may encounter within the world of sport. Okay, so to give some context then as to what we found within our research before moving a little bit more into gambling. This is just a broader context here around online abuse, online hate, online harms within sport. So if we look at some big data pieces and some quantitative research that's been published over the last few years, we've got the Alan Turing Institute, and they reported during the 21-22 season that there were almost 60,000 abusive tweets that were sent, and this is just on Twitter, now X, with 68% of players receiving abuse at least once. And during that particular report, it was found that Cristiano Ronaldo faced the most abuse, alongside Harry Maguire, the Manchester United and England centre-back. And again, there's various other reports that have found similar type of results there as well. If we look at the PFA, so the Professional Football Association, who also did a study and published it in 2021, they found that there were 48% increase in unmoderated racist online abuse in the second half of the 2020-2021 football season, with 50% of abusive accounts coming from the UK. Around that time, that was certainly the heart of the pandemic, later into 2020 and 2021. A lot of fans watching from home, so there was certainly a spike in abuse towards players. And the third bullet point we've got there is a report from FIFA from a couple of years ago, and they found that 55% of players at the European Championship in 2021, that's the men's and also the men's Africa Cup of Nations finals, received some form of online abuse. Now, the Tackling Online Hate Football project, we have managed to collect around about 50 million tweets across a 12-year period from 2008 to around 2020, 2022. So it's 12 to 14-year period. And that's covering the Euros, the World Cup, the Copa America, and AFCON, and that's in the men's and women's games. So we've got a lot of data across a 12, 14-year period that we've worked with. And we found that on average, it's roughly around 1% of the discourse online, on X, on Twitter, on X, is abusive. So 1% of the discussions using match hashtags, 1% is abusive, which sounds quite low. But when we think of the fact that between 2008 to 2022, even to this present day, that the amount of online traffic has increased significantly and it's still remaining at 1%, it means even though it is 1%, there is still more hate or abuse being posted online. So that's where we're at with the big data, and we're releasing some of the findings very soon. There's also a really good link there to the UEFA TV Outrage Social Media Abuse 10-minute short documentary. If anybody wanted to watch that, I'll recommend that one. Okay, so getting beyond kind of the general hate and abuse and moving specifically into gambling and how gambling-related harm impacts on athletes, players. There are various stories that we've seen over the last 10 years or so. Now, for me, this is one of the first cases that I've seen, and it's quite an extreme case. So in 2013, professional women's tennis player Rebecca Marino, she quit tennis. And And she claimed that it was after cyberbullying. And a big part of that she related to was gambling-related online harms. That as she broke onto the scene as a 21, 22-year-old, she reached the final, I believe, of a Grand Slam, and I believe she lost. And a lot of people had lost money on her as they put money on her to win. And then she started to get an onslaught of all this abuse. So this is going back to 11 years ago now, when she actually quit the sport for, it was around 6 months to a year until she returned. And a large part of that was the result of gambling-related online harms. They had a direct channel of communication to Rebecca Marino, and it really affected her and her mental health and well-being. So this is quite an extreme case from 10, 11 years ago now. And there are sadly more cases in relation to online-related gambling harms that we can see within the context of sport. And the next one also relates to tennis as well. So Caroline Garcia, and this is from this year at the US Open. So she was targeted by people online after she lost. And as I think this is from The Guardian, she said she received online abuse after a first-round defeat at the US Open, and said unhealthy betting was one of the main reasons why players are targeted on social media. So this is fast forward 11 years from Rebecca Marino, dramatically quitting the sport. And now we're seeing the same thing is happening to other players out there. And I think what we'll talk about a little bit later is it's quite interesting in terms of whether it's an individual sport, such as tennis, or whether it's a team sport, such as football or cricket, and how that might impact on the recipients and the targets of gambling-related online abuse. In this case, in tennis, these are individual athletes who are being targeted. And a lot of anger is directed towards these athletes for simply playing a sport, but not getting the result that those betting wanted to see. So Caroline Garcia is one of the most recent players to speak out in the context of tennis. But going further forward and looking again, this is from this year as well. In March, I actually had the pleasure of being in LA, California, and I was attending a conference out there, and it was during the time of March Madness, which, to be honest, I wasn't overly aware of until this year. But walking around and seeing the kind of the pubs and the TV screens everywhere, they had TV screens on of loads of different games in basketball, and the pubs were all packed out with people, attentively watching all of the basketball that was going on. And this is college athletics, really. Now, during this time, there appeared to be a huge spike in people speaking out about the abuse that they were getting, again in relation to gambling-related online harms. And the NCAA revealed that 1 in 3 athletes received abuse, again in relation to betting. So it says there's a betting interest in there, and more than 540 men's and women's college basketball players received similar abuse, including death threats during the championship tournaments in March. So there's a clear issue here, and it's not only in the context of the US and tennis, but we're also seeing very similar things in Australian sports as well, where other people have spoken out. So clearly, there is a bit of an issue when it comes to betting and online betting, and the link between that and the link in relation to the wider project that I've been looking at for the past few years, which is about online abuse and online harms. Before we started the project, this wasn't a theme that we were necessarily aware of, and there's very little academic work done in this space. And as we can see from the stories that are starting to appear now, that needs to change. And we certainly need to see more effort placed in this space, and more protection and support and training and even educational guidance for those who bet. So there are a lot of questions that we can ask here. And again, we'll try and speak to those questions a little bit later on. So bringing it back to the TOHIF project, we have our approach And this is what we've done. So we have conducted interviews, so qualitative, semi-structured interviews, and also done some focus groups as well, with 126 participants. Now, those participants include professional players, again, in the women's and the men's game. That's ex-professional players as well. So those who have recently retired and retired for the last 10, 15 years. Academy players, so those between 16 to 18 years old. So we've spoken to various clubs up and down the country and done focus groups there. And as I said, that is both within the men's and women's game. We've also interviewed safeguarding officers, equality, diversity, inclusion leads, player care, player liaison officers, all sorts connected to those clubs as well, to figure out what they're doing to protect players. We've also interviewed current and former international players, and the sample is relatively diverse, again, in terms of age, gender, race, ethnicity, nationality. One thing I will flag is that we certainly have more men's experiences in that sample, and that's something we are actively trying to change and trying to get more female voices within the research. So we're actively doing that now and doing focus groups and further interviews with women players to really understand their experience as well. So that's something we're committed to try and increase that side of the sample. The research questions then, I suppose these are three core questions that we had when we started the research. First of all is, what are the common triggers? So what are the things that cause or exacerbate online abuse and online hate? The second one is around really understanding the impact that online hate has on the recipients and the targets, really. So how does it affect them in terms of mental health, in terms of confidence, well-being, family life, you name it. So how does it affect them personally, but also professionally? And then the third one is to really consider what stakeholders and clubs are actively trying to do. And again, in relation to what we're talking about here, when we're talking about stakeholders, we're not only talking about the Football Association or the Premier League or the English Football League, we're also talking about gambling stakeholders as well. What can gambling stakeholders do to challenge or get involved in some of the issues that are facing contemporary sports people? So those are our three kind of core research questions. Now, in terms of the overarching themes, and as I've said, we've kind of analysed a lot of the work now. We're still undertaking a little bit more of the data collection, and especially with women's experiences, we're trying to get more in there. These are some of the overarching themes, and as you can see, I've highlighted those in bold, which link specifically to gambling, the theme around that. Sadly, the first and foremost, and this is unfortunate, is that many players just not only expect it, but they accept it, in the sense that some of the players have said, well, you know, fans pay our wages, therefore they're entitled to say what they want. I mean, actually, fans don't pay the wages, but there's a perception that they're just entitled to have those opinions and say whatever they want. And they do have these direct channels of communication, and therefore it's just part of the game. And our view very much is that shouldn't be normalized. That's unhealthy to normalize that, and we've got to challenge that, and not just accept that it's just likely to happen and that's it. You know, in other professions, you cannot imagine the same level of scrutiny and anger for just doing your job. As a lecturer, if those in the teaching profession started to get the same level of abuse for what they do, that wouldn't be stood for. So when it comes to sport, we shouldn't expect it and accept it in those spaces as well. Secondly, yeah, most abuse, and this certainly applies to men's football, is performance related. So it's if somebody's having a bad game or get a red card or whatever it might be, there's usually triggers there. So it's usually related to form or performance, and it's not necessarily linked to the protected characteristics or the identities of the players themselves. But of course, when something happens like a penalty miss or a red card, and you're from a minoritized ethnic background, for example, it does lead to racist outbursts, as we've seen with the European Championship final, which with England and the players that missed the penalties, unfortunately. So that does, of course, happen, but a lot of the time it's related to performance. There's wider harms, and I've alluded to this earlier in terms of sextortion. So players being bribed or whatever it might be. We've had death threats towards the players. So very, very serious examples of harmful activity directed at the players. Now, the fourth one down again links directly to what we're talking about and what the hub and the group is actively trying to research into, and certainly something that we as a research group and myself want to try and look into more. And it's around that specific gambling related online harms, which before going into the project, as I mentioned, we didn't possibly, or we weren't necessarily aware that that would be a major issue. But one of the things that we found, especially doing the focus groups with the academy players, is that certainly for those on the cusp of making their first team debuts and getting in and around the first team squad, we're starting to see those players are targeted by those who are gambling. Okay, so they will be sent messages to get a red card, miss a penalty, get a yellow card, you name it. So they're seen as easier targets. And again, I've got a really interesting but also sad and harrowing oral testimony that I will put on in I believe the next slide or the slide after that. So yeah, so gambling related online harms is evident. It is an issue. It backs up some of the wider news narratives that we're seeing at the moment in terms of tennis and college sports, and also coming out of Australia as well. We're seeing that there's a problem there, but we're not seeing that much research specifically in that space. And that's what I think that we can certainly contribute and work together and collaborate to do more in that space and try and understand that and challenge what's going on here. And the next one down is around the way that players react to it generally. And this still relates to online gambling and gambling harms. So many players certainly dismiss it as it's just and almost have a bravado around it, where there's, in the men's game specifically, there's a hyper masculinity that exists in those spaces. So generally there's a just brushing it off. Doesn't matter, won't affect me, don't talk about it, which is not necessarily healthy, as we'll see in the next slide or two time. Players struggle with online abuse when witnessed by family and friends, and that's something that was quite key in the research, and a core theme that did come out of it. The sense that if their family and friends started to notice or started to search for it, they would tell the player in question. They would say, have you seen what people are saying around you? And sometimes family and friends also started being a target themselves, which then was harder for the players to kind of process and get to grips with. And that sometimes affected the players more when people and loved ones around them were being targeted. Again, sad state of affairs. Next one is some players search for online conversations about them almost unhealthily to see what people are saying around them. And I'm sure that many people out there may have Googled themselves to see what's out there, or people with the same name. But when players are playing really well, they want to look on social media to see all the good things people are saying, but also when the form dips, they want to see what people are also saying about them as well, which can be quite traumatic as well when you see the volume of communication, but also abuse that players can sometimes face. Most players know the club processes, and pretty much all the clubs will have a process for dealing with this. Most of the time, though, players will internalize it and not really talk about it. And if they do talk about it, it's usually to parents, especially younger players, or family members. And if they are going to approach somebody in the club, it's usually a player care officer or the safeguarding officer. But it differs from club to club in terms of the structure of how to deal with this. Penultimate one on the slide there, we've got clubs often under-resourced regarding online abuse. Yeah, I'm going to pick that up a little bit later as well. So especially in League Two in football and League One, clubs are generally a bit under-resourced in this space, and it's usually one person or at most two people who deal with this, and it's a major issue. They're understaffed, so sometimes they're under-resourced and require materials or resources to help educate people around, for example. And again, that's something that as TOHIF we're trying to do. We're creating educational materials to circulate to the clubs that we've worked with and beyond as well. And finally, linking to what I've just said, training. There is training that exists out there around how to use social media, how to behave on social media, things like that, but not necessarily enough around how to cope with it and process online harms or online abuse when it comes your way. And the nuances of online abuse and online harms and what we've said around sextortion and bribery and death threats and even gambling related online harms, there is very little currently out there in relation to the world of football, which is where we've primarily focused in relation to that space. So there's very little around gambling related online harms or nothing that we've actually really come across, even though we've seen that certain players and experiences they've spoken out about this to us through the research. Okay, so we'll be going into the last kind of 5-10 minutes now. So types of abuse and harm. So this is just a snapshot of some of the experiences that the players have encountered. So this is a professional women's footballer who said that many of my teammates, we didn't want to go onto social media because of the comments that we were getting around how about their body and how they looked. It was less about how they played, which is quite interesting. As I said earlier, in terms of the men's game, it's about performances. That's usually where abuse kind of stems from. In terms of women's sport, a lot of the kind of online discourse and communication relates to how they look rather than how they were playing. So there's a difference there between the gendered aspect in terms of online harms, online abuse. The second one down, I mentioned about the wider harmful activity in terms of blackmail. So as one former professional men's footballer said, it's like people trying to blackmail you, like accounts. They try to pretend to be a girl, and then they try and set you up in order to kind of get money. So blackmailing of players is another kind of harmful activity that we've seen there as well. And then we've got the third one here, which specifically relates to gambling related harms. So is this player here, a young player coming through the ranks, a few years into life as a professional footballer, so starting out still, seen as potentially somebody that fans or gamblers can get to and might be able to sway. So this particular story is not a one-off. This is something that's happened repeatedly. And when he disclosed this within the focus group, the other players around him as well nodded and said, yeah, that's something that I've had and get as well. So this is arguably a common occurrence here, and it's shared across the footballing industry in relation to online related gambling harms. So as the player said, they were just saying oh, I bet on you to score, 1,000 on you to score, something like that. And you missed. Expletive your family. I hope you get injured and never play again. And like your mum, I hope she dies and stuff like that. So we see how serious and angry and abusive and harmful the rhetoric and the response to those who have lost bets on players to score goals. We see how harmful that is. Now, in this case, this particular player was such a lovely guy, a really, really nice guy. And his response when we asked, how did that make you feel? Was he said, I felt bad that I lost this person money, rather than actually saying, this is wrong and it's unacceptable and it shouldn't be happening. He actually said, I felt bad. I felt bad for the person instead, even though they threatened him and his family. And this is not a one-off occurrence, as I said before. This type of story is happening across the game. And as we've seen with the other examples I said at the beginning of the talk, in other sports. And arguably, it's going to get worse. And therefore, we need to certainly be aware of this. We need to step in. We need to conduct further research in this space to document what's going on. We need to ensure that the experiences of the people who are facing this and are targeted of this type of abuse, we understand what it's like, and then we actually create research-informed outputs and measures to challenge against this and protect players, but also the education of fans themselves and the education of the gamblers and the gambling community need to be aware of this, that this is not acceptable behavior. So what can we do in that space? So there's plenty of ideas, there's plenty of ways we can work in this space. And certainly, as I said earlier, this is something we weren't necessarily aware of or expecting within the research, but certainly has come out of the interviews and certainly the focus groups with the younger players especially. So in terms of the experiences then, and consider the impact that this has on younger players who are kind of in and around the game and making their debuts. And what I should also say as well is it adds unnecessary pressure onto those young players. So for example, if in football, if a young player receives that message half an hour before kickoff and reads that message, they have to report that message to a safeguarding officer in advance of stepping onto the pitch. If they don't, and they were to get a yellow card, for example, and they weren't reporting that message, they could then face a ban. And that would not be good, of course. So it's adding unnecessary pressure onto players before they even go out on the pitch. That they certainly don't need that kind of added pressure there as well. So as we see from some of the experience and the impact from the players, this is a professional women's footballer who made a first team debut and started to become better known. I went from 2,000 to 3,000 followers to 28,000 within a matter of hours. It was traumatizing for me, I must say. So certainly there's something that needs to happen around preparing players to deal with what's likely to happen. So going from all those followers and then more interactions, more eyes on you, all that kind of stuff. And then if there's more people following you, it's likely that you might get more abuse in turn. Another one, this is a professional men's footballer. At the start of my career, when I was a bit younger, I was online. I was looking through a lot of messages, and they said that it starts to knock your confidence a little bit. Another one here, professional men's footballer. I got into a massive, massive slump of reading all the comments, and then ends up carrying on to say, I was just getting myself down. So it certainly can affect mental health, well-being, and I think that is something that we really need to be aware of in the game, how it not only affects your confidence and performance from a performance point of view, but also it can affect your mental health and well-being, and clubs absolutely need to work and be aware of this. And then the fourth one down on the page there is that the players were reading the online comments, and they were losing confidence. They were talking about it in the changing room, so sharing experience, which to me is healthy to be sharing what's going on. Okay, so getting into the final couple of slides now. Really quickly, the response to this in terms of online abuse, online harms within football, the stakeholder response. Well, a few years ago, we had the social media boycott. So we had the likes of the Premier League and the EFL and Women's Football League, Super League, etc. All of those big organisations, the PFA included, and even I think it was F1 and other sports as well, all got together and they did the boycott. So the boycott was 4 days off social media to not go on it, to try and put pressure on social media organisations themselves to change their ways. Didn't really lead to any major benefits or change at all. But one thing that we could say positively about the boycott is it did get those stakeholders together who have historically not really communicated in this space of online abuse, it got them chatting together to think about what they could do. They chose to do the boycott. There's other ways they could have gone about doing that. So yeah, that's one of the things that's happened. But also we've got to understand that all of those organisations on there have kind of training workshops that they will go into clubs and speak to the players. Some clubs, or most clubs, will do in-house training as well, so where they speak to their players around online etiquette and how to behave, all of that kind of stuff. But in terms of the educational content, in terms of the resources, we think it has to be research informed. They have to be aware of the wider harmful activities that is going on. And gambling is one of those which is not really currently spoken about in the game. So the response is that things are happening. Governing bodies are aware. Clubs are doing what they can. Many of the clubs in the lower leagues are under-resourced, and they're not really aware of all of the harmful activities that face the players. They're not aware of all of those things that are going on, which is coming out of the research right now. Okay, so this is basically my last slide here, and this is a question for those listening and those within this network, because as I've tried to outline here, is that specifically gambling related online harms is something that is not necessarily covered as much in academic research in relation to online abuse, and that kind of connection between gambling and then the onslaught and the attack of the recipient, the target, who's whether it's a tennis player or a football player that misses a penalty or gets a red card, you name it. There's a link there between the two, and losing a bet exacerbates online abuse. Okay. And I think that we need to be able to quantify what's happening there. And I'm sure that there's some research out there, which I'm vaguely aware of. There is some, work in that space, which is fantastic to see. But we need to ensure we're aware of what's going on and the correlation between that. And then we need to consider collectively, how can we as researchers, how can we help illuminate, not only illuminate, but challenge these issues? What can we do with our research, and what can we do with this network to challenge these issues? That's the first thing. The second thing is, based on what we've talked about here, and based on the fact that Rebecca Marino quit tennis 11 years ago, and we've got other tennis players since who have spoken about this, college athletes who are 18, 19 years old, being abused online, and death threats for linked to gambling. Okay, how do we support these players? How do we protect these athletes from the impact of what's going on? So what does that look like? If it's education, what does that look like? So I think that's a really important point, and I think that working with the stakeholders would be really, really good to do, to kind of embed that. And again, on TOHIF, we're doing work in that space, but again, a lot of work needs to happen there. And then finally, we've got what can and should gambling organisations do. So, your likes of Ladbrokes and Paddy Power and all of those organisations, to what extent and what role do they play in trying to protect and support and challenge the link there between gambling and online abuse? What role can they play? Because they certainly can play a role, whether it's about education of those betting and the online the gambling community, and then stakeholders as well. So football related stakeholders as well as gambling organisations. What can we do in that space to challenge this issue? So there's a lot of questions and a lot of future work that needs to happen. And I think we're only just starting to scratch the surface there in terms of what's happening here. And I certainly, and my research team certainly, would like to play a role in going further forward in helping illuminate some of this, but also coming up with mechanisms and support strategies to challenge this. And I believe that is it for me. So thanks very much for listening. And yeah, if there's any questions, I will take them now.
Again, a massive thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your really important research with us this afternoon. Thanks to everybody for attending, and have a good afternoon, everybody.